nuclear weapons can seriously compete with the internet and antibiotics for the title of the most significant invention in human history. It's hard to find scientists who deny that atomic bombs were a major reason for the sharp decline in global conflicts since the mid-20th century. Of course, there are still many wars on the planet. But from the perspective of human history, nothing has really changed. Unfortunately, wars have always existed and, it seems, always will. Nuclear weapons have merely reduced the number of large-scale wars. After all, everyone understands that mutual destruction is senseless. But will mutual destruction really happen? Or is it a historical myth? Is nuclear winter real? That's what we're going to talk about in the next couple of minutes, as we learn more about nuclear weapons. Our first stop, of course, will be Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Terrifying and, fortunately, the only disasters involving the use of nuclear weapons. They are the easiest to use as a reference point, an example that immediately leads us to the first myth about atomic bombs. That myth is their supposedly insane lethality, which allegedly caused Japan's immediate surrender. That's simply not true, as Tokyo suffered nearly the same level of destruction without nuclear weapons. On March 10, 1945, in a single day, 334 US B-29 bombers destroyed 40% of the city's residential buildings. That's roughly the same amount of destruction the atomic bomb caused in Nagasaki. The casualties were similar as well. In just one day of bombing Tokyo, at least 80,000 people died by the most conservative estimates. The reality is that, from the perspective of World War II, there wasn't a significant difference between nuclear weapons and conventional bombings. On February 13 to 14, 1945, around 100,000 people died as a result of the Allied bombing of Dresden. And that's not even mentioning chemical weapons, which can easily rival nuclear arms. In 1935 to 1936, Italian chemical attacks killed 275,000 Ethiopians. The number of casualties in Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't come close, not even to the major battles, but not even to some ordinary engagements of World War II. During just a couple of weeks of the Białystok-Minsk battle, the USSR alone lost 341,000 people. The casualties from the atomic bombings were far from the main reason Japan surrendered. They were losing far more people to conventional bombings, and ultimately surrendered due to the Soviet Union entering the war. This was precisely what Emperor Hirohito cited as the main reason in his statement on August 17, 1945. Hiroshima and Nagasaki weren't even mentioned in the document. However, in the events that followed, fear of nuclear weapons was greatly amplified by the uncertainty over how many bombs the US had, and by the lack of clear understanding of the true scale of destruction. That brings us to the second myth about nuclear weapons, that bombings allegedly wipe entire cities off the map, making the area uninhabitable. In reality, things aren't quite like that either. In an airburst with a yield of 1 megaton, the zone of total destruction is under 4 kilometers, moderate destruction spans about 7 kilometers, and at a distance of 10 kilometers, only about 5% of the population would die. And this refers to a standard modern bomb. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were dozens of times weaker. In Hiroshima, the main destructive factor was fire, as the city was built in a typical Japanese style, with wooden and cardboard structures. Geographic location also played a role. In hilly Nagasaki, a firestorm never formed, and most of the brick buildings remained standing. In other words, nuclear bombs are terrifying, but they don't turn vast cities into dust. One might argue that this is no longer relevant, since the nuclear capabilities of nations have grown dramatically since Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and humanity could now blanket each other with a huge number of bombs. That, too, is a myth, because nuclear weapons are insanely expensive. It's often claimed that the bombing of Tokyo during World War II was the result of thousands of people and munitions, while Hiroshima and Nagasaki were destroyed with just a single bomb, making nuclear warfare much cheaper. But that's simply not true. In 1945, the Manhattan Project's budget made up 90% of all U.S. spending on small arms and nearly 40% of all spending on tanks. The two bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki cost as much as tens of thousands of tanks and aircraft, and the money spent on them equaled that of 9 out of every 10 rifles produced in the U.S. And that's just the bombs themselves. They still had to be delivered. The budget for developing the B-29 bomber was even higher than that for the atomic bomb, and it's considered the most expensive project of World War II. You might argue that this refers only to development, and that mass production is cheaper. That's also a mistake. Producing atomic bombs is insanely expensive. And more importantly, they require constant maintenance. For example, the US is currently modernizing its WWII nuclear warheads, and each one is expected to cost $75 million. According to calculations by nuclear expert Stephen Schwartz, the US spent $5 trillion on its nuclear arsenal between 1940 and 1998. For comparison, that's equivalent to 25 years of China's annual military budget as of 2024. So, it's hard to call nuclear weapons cheap with a straight face. The US and other countries are reducing their nuclear stockpiles not out of kindness or goodwill. If nuclear weapons were truly cheap and simple, those stockpiles would only continue to grow. Surely, we're not naive enough to believe in humanitarian disarmament for the sake of mankind, are we? If you still have doubts, the next myth will clear them up. This myth is about the supposed simplicity and safety of nuclear weapons. It's often claimed that without a detonator, you could play football with one and nothing would happen. That's partly true, but reality is far more complex. History is full of incidents involving nuclear warheads. For example, an investigation by the National Interest revealed that at least 1,200 US nuclear weapons were involved in dangerous incidents between 1950 and 1998. And we're not talking about someone spilling tea on a warhead. In 1980, a worker in Arkansas accidentally dropped a socket from a wrench into the shaft of a Titan II missile. It punctured the rocket's first-stage fuel tank, causing a fuel leak. The personnel were urgently evacuated. But at 3 a.m. on September 19th, the missile, armed with a W-53 nuclear warhead, exploded. The 740-ton silo cover was blown off like a feather. Even though the warhead appeared to remain intact, it didn't exactly calm US military command. So, the next time you feel clumsy or frustrated with yourself, remember the guy with the wrench in Arkansas. There was another, no less dramatic, incident. On January 24, 1961, a B-52 bomber was carrying 2 thermonuclear bombs, each 260 times more powerful than the ones dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. A fuel leak was discovered, which led to the aircraft breaking apart and several crew members dying. According to protocol, the bombs detached from the plane, but only one of the parachutes deployed properly. Even more alarming, 3 out of 4 safety mechanisms on one of the bombs failed, bringing it to full armed status. Only a low-voltage switch prevented a catastrophe of unimaginable scale in the US. As for the second bomb, it was torn apart so violently that its plutonium core and a mass of radioactive debris had to be recovered by Army engineers. Now consider this. Incidents like these, over 1,000 of them, were recorded in just 40 years. That alone explains why countries are scaling down their nuclear arsenals. It's insanely expensive, dangerously risky, and carries consequences beyond comprehension. So, now that we've covered that, let's move on to some other myths. Take, for example, the myth of irreversible radioactive contamination of an area. A small spoiler: Hiroshima and Nagasaki are now fully inhabited. More specifically, radiation intensity decreases 10-fold 7 hours after a nuclear explosion, 100-fold after 49 hours, and 1,000-fold after 343 hours. Between 1945 and 1970, leukemia rates among Japanese survivors of the bombings were roughly double the norm. That's frightening, but it still accounts for only about 1% of the total population. Moreover, within a year of the bombing, Hiroshima was under the control of 40,000 American soldiers. At the time, radiation sickness wasn't understood, and troops walked around in regular clothing, yet no mass fatalities were recorded. Again, let's recall that both cities were made almost entirely of wood and lacked proper shelters. Had there been reinforced infrastructure in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, casualty figures would have been very different. At Bikini Atoll, for instance, the US tested a 15-megaton hydrogen bomb. 4 years later, when biologists arrived, they made a surprising discovery. Meter-long corals were blooming in the crater, and the underwater ecosystem had fully recovered. So, the idea that Earth would become a nuclear wasteland, even if all bombs were detonated at once, is not something we should realistically expect. To put it briefly, the myth that a nuclear war could split the Earth was invented during the Cold War. In reality, a ground explosion of an extremely powerful 58-megaton bomb, similar to the Tsar Bomba, the most powerful atomic bomb ever designed by man, would create a crater about 200 meters in diameter. There's even a fairly simple formula to calculate the impact of such explosions. For instance, when creating the artificial Lake Chagan in 1965, engineers drilled a shaft 178 meters deep. Even then, the resulting crater was only about 100 meters deep. Cracking the planet or breaking through the Earth's crust isn't even a hypothetical possibility. It's on the level of urban legend. The same goes for the claim that detonating all the world's nuclear weapons would wipe out life on Earth 10 times over. The average yield of current warheads is about half a megaton. But even if we assume 5 megaton bombs and calculate their deadly effects distributed over the Earth's surface, it would take around 70,000 warheads. Humanity simply doesn't have that many. Only about 13,000 exist, and most are significantly weaker. And if people tried to build that many, they'd run into the myths we've already discussed. It would take many trillions of dollars, and the risk of accidents and disasters would be so high that no one would go through with it. So, to summarize, fortunately or unfortunately, nuclear weapons just aren't as apocalyptic as they're often portrayed in the public imagination. Recently declassified U.S. intelligence data suggests that, according to their calculations, about 100 warheads per country are enough to maintain power parity and deter world war. Will humanity manage to stick to that? Time will tell. That's all from us for now. Until next time, from the bunker, friends.